The first time I realized how completely I had trusted her was the moment everything finally collapsed. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug she had bought me years ago, staring at a message on my phone that felt heavier than any truth I had ever carried. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was misunderstanding it. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, something in my chest already knew. The betrayal hadn't started that day. That day was just when it stopped hiding. My name is Daniel, and for most of my adult life, I believed trust was built by staying quiet, by being steady, by never asking too much from anyone. After my wife passed away, that belief hardened into a rule I lived by. I became a single father overnight, raising my son Ethan while trying to convince myself that I didn't need anything else. I told myself that love, real love, was something that belonged to another version of my life, one that had ended too soon. Then she came along. Her name was Laura, and she had a way of stepping into a room without asking permission, not loudly, not forcefully, just with a warmth that made space around her feel safer. She met Ethan before she ever really met me. I remember watching from across the playground as she knelt down to his level, listening to his rambling story about dinosaurs like it was the most important thing in the world. When he laughed, really laughed, something inside me loosened. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding everything together until that moment. Trust didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Laura started showing up on Tuesdays because she knew those were the hardest days for me. She remembered Ethan's favorite cereal. She learned the rhythm of our evenings, the way homework turned into dinner, which turned into exhaustion that sank into my bones. She never rushed me. She never pushed. She just stayed. That was how she earned my trust, by being there when she didn't have to be. Over time, I let her see the parts of my life I had kept sealed shut. I told her about the nights I sat in my car after work, just breathing, afraid to bring my exhaustion into the house. I told her about the guilt that came with laughing again, like I was betraying a memory by moving forward. She listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. When she held my hand, it wasn't dramatic. It was grounding. Real. Ethan adored her. That should have scared me more than it did. But Laura was careful, always careful, never stepping into a role she hadn't been invited into. She helped with homework when Ethan asked. She sat in the front row at his school play, clapping the loudest. One night, when he fell asleep on the couch, she covered him with a blanket and whispered, "He's a good kid. You're doing a good job." No one had said that to me in a long time, so I trusted her. Completely. I trusted her with my routines, my weaknesses, my quiet hopes for a future that didn't feel so lonely. I trusted her when she said she was working late. I trusted her when she took calls in the other room. I trusted her because she had never given me a reason not to. And because after loss, trust feels like a risk you take only once. The cracks were small at first, so small I barely noticed them. A canceled dinner here, a distracted look there. She started checking her phone more often, the screen lighting up her face with expressions I couldn't quite read. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said she was just tired. I believed her. Of course I did. I had built my life on believing her. The night everything changed wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors. Ethan was already asleep. The house was quiet in that fragile way it gets after a long day. Laura had gone to take a shower, leaving her phone on the counter. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. I was just clearing space, trying to make room for the next morning's chaos. That was when the message lit up. I won't repeat what it said, not word for word. Some things lose their power when you say them out loud, but it was enough. Enough to pull the ground out from under me. Enough to connect dots I hadn't even realized were there. A name I recognized. A familiarity that went far beyond innocent. A promise that didn't belong to me. I stood there for a long time, phone in my hand, listening to the shower run, feeling something inside me fracture quietly. My first thought wasn't anger. It was confusing. How could someone who had been so careful with my heart be so careless with the truth? How could the person I trusted to protect my son's sense of safety be living a life I knew nothing about? When Laura came back into the room, towel around her shoulders, she took one look at my face and knew. The silence between us stretched. heavy and unforgiving. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just held up the phone and asked, "Is this real?" Her expression told me everything before she ever spoke. And in that moment, as the truth finally surfaced, I realized that betrayal doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from someone choosing themselves in ways they were too afraid to admit. But understanding that didn't make it hurt any less. It didn't soften the way my trust broke, clean and sharp, like glass. Because when you trust someone completely, you don't brace for impact. You just fall. Laura sat down slowly, like her body had forgotten how to move naturally. She didn't reach for me. She didn't rush to explain. That hesitation hurt more than any words could have. It was the pause that told me she had rehearsed this moment in her head, even if she'd never planned for it to happen like this. I remember thinking how strange it was that after everything we'd shared, after all the nights she'd spent in our home, silence was what finally stood between us. "It's not what you think," she said at last, her voice unsteady. That sentence landed like a dull echo. I didn't respond. I had learned, through years of grief and parenting, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. Not because you believe, but because you need to understand exactly where the truth bends. She started talking about loneliness, about fear, about how stepping into my life, into Ethan's life, had been heavier than she'd admitted to herself. She said she loved us, that she cared deeply. But there were parts of her that still felt untethered, parts that wanted something simpler, something that didn't come with history and responsibility. The messages, she claimed, were a mistake that got out of hand, comfort that blurred into something else. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I needed her to keep going. Every word felt like a weight added to my chest, pressing down on the version of me that had believed trust was enough to keep everything intact. "What about Ethan?" I asked quietly. She flinched. That was the moment I knew she hadn't thought this through in the way I had. I thought about Ethan constantly. Every decision I made ran through him first, filtered by how it might affect his sense of safety, his sense of home. Laura's hesitation told me she hadn't been asking herself the same questions. "I never meant to hurt him," she said. I believed that. I also knew intent didn't undo damage. That night, she packed a bag. Not dramatically. No tears falling onto folded clothes. Just a careful gathering of things, as if she were afraid to disturb the space she was leaving behind. Ethan slept through it all. His door cracked open just enough for the hallway light to spill across the floor. I stood there, watching her move around our kitchen, memorizing the sound of her footsteps, already grieving something that hadn't technically ended yet. When she reached the door, she turned back to me. "I hope one day you understand," she said. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't understand, but because understanding didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like a separate, colder thing. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Ethan noticed, of course. Children always do. He asked where Laura was. I told him she had to take some time away. I didn't lie. But I didn't tell the whole truth either. Protecting him felt like the last promise I could still keep. At night, after he fell asleep, I replayed everything. Every look I'd missed. Every moment I'd chosen trust over curiosity. It would have been easy to turn then inward, to blame myself for believing, for opening the door at all. But grief had already taught me what that road looked like, and I knew where it ended. So instead, I sat with the pain, let it exist without trying to justify it. What surprised me most was how deeply the betrayal cut. Not because I loved Laura more than I'd realized, but because I had let myself hope. I had imagined a future where Ethan had another steady adult in his life, where our small family could expand without losing its shape. Losing Laura meant losing that vision, and that loss echoed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Weeks passed, then months. Laura reached out once, a brief message asking how Ethan was doing. I stared at it for a long time before replying with a simple, "He's okay." I didn't ask how she was. I didn't offer anything beyond that. Some boundaries form naturally when trust breaks. You don't have to build walls. You just stop leaving doors open. Life moved forward, because it always does. Mornings were still rushed. Homework still needed checking. Ethan still needed rides to practice, still needed reassurance on days when the world felt too big. I poured myself into being present for him, into rebuilding a sense of normal that had been shaken but not destroyed. And then something unexpected happened. Ethan started talking more. About school, about friends, about feelings he hadn't voiced before. One evening, as we sat at the table eating dinner, he looked up at me and said, "Dad, are you sad?" The question caught me off guard. I considered brushing it off, offering the kind of answer adults often give to protect children from complexity. But then I remembered how it felt to be unseen, to have emotions treated like inconveniences. So I told him the truth, carefully. I said that sometimes grown-ups feel sad, but that it doesn't mean everything is broken. It just means we're human. He nodded, absorbing that in his quiet, thoughtful way. Then he said something that stayed with me. "It's okay. We still have each other." In that moment, I realized that while Laura's betrayal had broken something in me, it hadn't taken away the core of my life. The trust between Ethan and me was still intact. The home we had built, imperfect as it was, still stood. And maybe, just maybe, that was the foundation I needed to start again. Not with someone new. Not yet. But with myself. Healing doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It slips in quietly, almost unnoticed. Disguised as routine for me. It came in small moments that didn't feel important at the time. Packing Ethan's lunch without my hands shaking. Walking past the park Laura used to visit with us. And not needing to stop. Sleeping through the night without replaying old conversations like broken recordings. I didn't date. Not because I was afraid, at least not consciously, but because my life already felt full in a way that demanded care. Work had picked up, and parenting alone required an attention that left little room for emotional risk. Friends tried to set me up, offering gentle encouragement wrapped in humor, but I always found a way to decline without making it awkward. I wasn't closed off. I was just careful. Ethan, on the other hand, was changing in ways that reminded me time doesn't pause for anyone. He grew taller, his questions sharper, his silences more thoughtful. He had started asking about his mom more often, not with the raw pain he used to carry, but with curiosity. I answered honestly when I could, gently when I couldn't. We were learning how to talk about loss without letting it swallow the room. One Saturday afternoon, months after Laura left, Ethan had a soccer game in a small field on the edge of town. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain, but the kids didn't seem to care. Parents lined the sidelines with folding chairs and paper cups of coffee, shouting encouragement and advice no one asked for. I stood with my hands in my pockets, watching Ethan run, feeling a familiar mix of pride and worry. That was where I met Claire. She was standing a few feet away, cheering for a boy on the opposing team. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried warmth. When our eyes met, we exchanged the polite, knowing smile of two adults temporarily united by the chaos of children's sports. I didn't think much of it. She was just another parent, another face in a crowd. But fate has a way of repeating itself in different tones. Later, as the rain finally started to fall, parents scrambled to gather bags and kids. Ethan ran toward me, soaked and smiling, his jersey clinging to him. Claire's son ran to her at the same time, laughing. We stood there, juggling towels and water bottles, sharing a moment of mutual exhaustion. "Looks like they had fun," she said. "They always do," I replied. "Rain just makes it better." She laughed, and something about the sound of it felt easy. Not electric, not dramatic, just human. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing personal, just small things. The weather, the league. How kids seem to have endless energy when adults don't. When we parted, she waved and said, "See you next week." I told myself it didn't mean anything. And for a while, it didn't. But over the next few weeks, our conversations grew longer. Still safe, still light. She mentioned she was a single mom. I didn't ask questions. I knew better than to rush into shared pain. But there was an unspoken understanding there. A recognition that we both carried invisible histories. One evening, after practice, Ethan nudged me and whispered, "You like talking to her." I looked down at him, surprised. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged. "You smile different." That comment stayed with me long after we got home. I wondered when my expressions had become something Ethan could read so easily. I wondered how long I'd been living in a way that muted joy without realizing it. Claire and I never called. what we were doing anything specific. We didn't define it, didn't label it, didn't rush to assign meaning. We just existed in each other's orbit. Sometimes she'd bring extra snacks for the kids. Sometimes I'd help her low gear into her car. Once, when Ethan had a rough day and refused to get out of the car, she waited patiently nearby, pretending not to listen while I talked him through it. That patience mattered more to me than grand gestures ever could. Still, fear doesn't disappear just because life improves. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat alone on the couch, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Laura's face appeared unexpectedly, frozen in a moment when I had believed everything was solid. My chest tightened. I put the phone down, suddenly overwhelmed by the thought of trusting again. The next time I saw Claire, I pulled back slightly. I kept conversations shorter. I avoided eye contact. I told myself I was protecting Ethan, protecting myself. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid of repeating the same mistake. Claire noticed. People always do. When you change the rhythm. One afternoon, as the kids ran off to play, she looked at me and said, "Did I do something wrong?" The question caught me off guard. I shook my head immediately. "No, not at all." "Then what is it?" she asked gently. I hesitated. Old instincts told me to deflect, to minimize, to keep things surface level. But another part of me, the part that had learned from betrayal rather than hardened by it, knew that honesty was the only way forward, even if it led nowhere. I'm not very good at this, I admitted. Trusting, letting things be, hopeful. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to reassure me. She just listened. "I've been hurt before," I continued, "and I have a kid who's already lost enough. I can't afford to be wrong again." Claire nodded slowly. "I get that," she said. "I'm not looking for promises. I'm just looking for honesty." That sentence felt like an open hand, not pulling me forward, not pushing me back, just offering space. For the first time in a long while, I realized something important. Betrayal had taught me caution, but it had also taught me clarity. I knew what I couldn't accept anymore. I knew the questions I needed to ask. I knew that trust wasn't blind faith. It was a choice, made carefully, rebuilt slowly, and maybe, just maybe, I was ready to try again. Not because I needed someone to fill a void, but because I had learned how to stand without one. Summer came quietly that year, softening the edges of winter's lingering gray. Ethan spent long afternoons at the park, his laughter cutting through the air like music I had almost forgotten how to hear. Claire would join occasionally, a picnic blanket in tow, sandwiches for the kids, water bottles lined up neatly. We didn't talk about feelings. We didn't define what we were. We simply existed in this gentle rhythm, a safe orbit around shared responsibilities and mutual respect. It was the kind of closeness that, if you weren't careful, could blossom into something deeper without either of you noticing, until it had already rooted itself firmly in your life. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Ethan building a fort in the living room. Cushions, blankets, chairs all assembled with the meticulousness only a child could manage. Claire had helped, judging by the extra sparkles in the construction and the small stack of board games she left beside it. She smiled when I walked in, brushing damp hair from her face. "You should see the commander of this fortress," she said, nodding toward Ethan, who grinned sheepishly. "He's very persuasive." I laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension that had shadowed me since Laura's betrayal loosen. I realized I could breathe again, not just exist. But life doesn't let you forget entirely. A message appeared on my phone later that night, from Laura. Short, to the point, something about a misunderstanding, something she wanted to clarify. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at me, not from desire, but from a need to close the book properly, to set boundaries firmly for good. I read her words carefully, noting her tone, her half apologies, her lingering hesitations. Nothing actionable, nothing threatening, just a ghost reaching out. I set the phone down, my chest tight, and looked across the room at Claire. She was kneeling beside Ethan, reading a story in a voice that made the characters feel alive. Her patience, her steadiness, the ease with which she navigated our small chaos, it reminded me why trust, when earned and nurtured, could be rebuilt, slowly, deliberately. I realized the difference between someone who entered my life for temporary comfort and someone who chose to stay through the difficult, messy, ordinary days. A month later, Claire invited us to a small barbecue with her friends. Casual, relaxed, with the laughter of children and adults mingling in the warm evening air. I watched Claire engage effortlessly, listening, laughing, steering conversations with subtle grace. Ethan darted between games of tag and frisbee, occasionally glancing back at me with that same quiet reassurance that everything would be okay. It was there, in the gentle ordinariness of that evening, that I understood something fundamental. Trust didn't have to be monumental to be meaningful. Sometimes, it was in the small, repeated actions that life felt safe again. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Claire and I found ourselves alone in the living room. A simple silence settled over us. Comfortable, not demanding. I remember the heaviness that had shadowed me for months, the lingering sting of betrayal, the nights spent questioning whether I could ever open my heart again. Now, in this quiet space, I could feel the first cautious stirrings of hope. I told her, simply, about the shadows I carried, about Laura, about the fear that love, once broken, could never be whole again. She didn't flinch. She didn't judge. She just listened, nodding, offering small acknowledgments that felt like bridges being built across years of pain. Days turned into weeks. Trust deepened, slowly, without dramatic gestures, without overwhelming confessions. I learned that the real test wasn't in grand declarations but in consistency. When Claire said she would be there, she was. When she promised attention, she delivered it. The walls I had built around my heart didn't crumble instantly, but they softened in ways that mattered. Ethan noticed the change too. One afternoon, as we played catch in the backyard, he stopped mid-throw and said, "Dad, you're smiling a lot more." His words were simple, but the impact was profound. I realized that even children, in their innocent observation, could sense when life began to shift back toward light. It was affirmation I hadn't realized I needed. Life could be normal again. Life could be safe again. And then came the turning point. It wasn't monumental. There was no dramatic confrontation or cinematic revelation. It was an ordinary Friday evening. Claire and I cooking together while Ethan did homework at the kitchen table. She accidentally spilled a bit of sauce on the counter and laughed, apologizing in that understated way that made mistakes feel human instead of catastrophic. I looked at her, this woman who had entered my life cautiously, patiently, and I realized that trust, when rebuilt, felt like air, natural, necessary, unremarkable in the best sense, and yet powerful. We sat down to eat, and for a few minutes, the world outside our small home didn't exist. Laura was no longer a shadow lingering over my heart. Betrayal had left its mark, yes, but it hadn't dictated my future. I could choose warmth, stability, and patience. I could allow myself to be present fully without fear that the past would consume the present. Claire caught my eye across the table. Her expression was gentle, inviting, steady. No games, no hidden motives, just the reality of shared life unfolding in front of us. Ethan looked up from his homework, smiled at both of us, and I knew then that we were creating a version of family that was real and perfect and resilient. Not because we were perfect, but because we chose each other every day. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Claire and I lingered in the living room. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comforting. We didn't need to define everything. We didn't need to label our feelings or outline the future. The simple act of being there, side by side, was enough. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like a lesson, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the resilience required to rebuild it. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I understood something fundamental. Heartbreak doesn't have to be the end. Betrayal doesn't have to dictate the narrative. Life, love, and trust can be rebuilt not in leaps, not in fireworks, but in steady, careful increments. And when you allow yourself to rebuild, to open, to trust again, the result can be something enduring, something real, something that feels like home.